An Australian frontier. Its breathtaking beauty, its natural splendour, belies a dilemma it has grappled with for almost a century. A dilemma of a people caught between the commitment to the customs and beliefs of their ancestors and the problems of survival against the encroachment of Western civilization. Many have tried to relieve, to ease the painful conflict. But success for one man, at least, remains in the hands of God.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread.
And forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us.
John Jobst has been reciting the Lord's Prayer since 1951, in a land he then described as God-forsaken. The heat, the flies, the dust, the inhospitable nature of Australia's outback was in sharp contrast to his native Bavaria. But he had been at odds with his environment before. As a teenager in Nazi Germany, John Jobst was conscripted and sent to Russia as a medical orderly. Hitler had ordered his armies not to stop to bury the enemy dead. With his pre-war seminary training, the young Jobst could not bring himself to ignore the plight of mankind.
Well, I found the war experience very futile, and I thought I'd like to do something worthwhile with my life. And I thought if I could help people in their spiritual needs and help them in every possible way and do something more constructive and creative for mankind than shooting people or trying to destroy people rather than help them.
Thousands of kilometres away, the realities of war were being felt by the people John Jobst would come to dedicate his life to try to help. In 1943, the September sky above the northernmost tip of Western Australia brought death and destruction. The target of the Japanese bombers, the small settlement of Columbaroo, was to become another battleground 4 decades later. A battle which was to test the same belief and determination John Jobst first demonstrated during the Second World War. While Columbaroo was being rebuilt in the aftermath of the war, a young ordained John Jobst was sent to Australia to gain missionary experience. He was forced to hurriedly teach himself the English language aboard ship.
There was only one Englishman on that ship. It was a migrant ship. And his name was Vanderbilt, if you don't mind. He was an Englishman, but had a Dutch name. And he taught us English. Of course, we used the Oxford accent. And when we arrived in Australia, we found, of course, that the Australian accent was, again, slightly different.
But nothing he learned en route prepared him for the shock awaiting him at the end of his journey, halfway around the world.
I said, oh my God, I said, well, how am I going to survive in that God-forsaken place? I said, you know, coming from a country where there's music, every library you can go to, there's the opera, there's entertainment, there's anything, there's social life. But here, there was none of that at all.
This was where John Jobst got his introduction to Australia. As then, the church tower dominates the skyline of Beagle Bay, the first mission established for Aborigines in the north of Western Australia. Founded by the Trappist monks from France in 1890, and later given over to the German-based Palatine order, 3 generations of Aborigines have been educated here. But the history of Beagle Bay has been dogged by controversy. The inhabitants of the settlement were taken, often forcibly, from many different tribes. Husbands, wives, and children separated and thrust into a European and disciplined lifestyle. The result was a gradual deterioration of many rich cultures and an alienation of people from their native lands. Now an Aboriginal activist, Peter Yu was a product of the Beagle Bay education system.
My grandfather was born to the south of Broome. He's a Yaru man, but was taken by police to Beagle Bay Mission, where he met my grandmother, who comes from Fitzroy Crossing, was a Bunaba woman, because the government's policy of taking, you know, half-caste kids or mixed-blood Aboriginal kids off their parents and putting them on the mission. And so my mother was born there in Beagle Bay and grew up in the mission system, with the dormitories, with, you know, the kids separated from their parents, and they're brought up by the nuns and the priests in separate sort of dormitories.
This daily ritual was used to summon to church, to work, or to school the hundreds of Aboriginal residents. Now it serves to mark the meal times of the 2 aged priests who remain at Beagle Bay. Many of the Aboriginal descendants of the original families have long gone. Those who stay have severed formal links with the church and established a cooperative to administer what they claim as their own: the houses, old and new, the roads, a community store, and surrounding land. Their Europeanization, though, has left an indelible mark. The only testimony to the toil, the struggle, the dreams of Beagle Bay has become a tourist attraction. Traditional decorative materials were not available in such a remote location. So the German priests, interned at the mission during the First World War, and their Aboriginal charges, used the only resource available: thousands upon thousands of live shells, mother of pearl, cockles, crocus, cowries, and volutes, gathered from the nearby reefs. 60,000 bricks were baked in stone kilns, and the shells inlaid throughout the interior of the church, giving it an almost ghostly translucence. The unique church architecture impressed John Jobst on his arrival at Beagle Bay in 1951, but that was all which impressed him. Privately, he thought the area God-forsaken, and his departure couldn't come soon enough. However, 8 years later, he returned to take charge of not only Beagle Bay, but of a staggering 773,000 square kilometres of one of the most remote and desolate areas in the world. John Jobst was consecrated Bishop of Broome, with a diocese covering the Kimberley region of Western Australia, an area many times the size of his native Bavaria. But the problems presented by the sheer vastness of the Kimberley were surpassed by the more immediate problems of a beleaguered church, which, he now tells conferences, almost meant the end of the church.
In the early 60s, I was faced with the problem of building up or pulling out. The missions were run down. The German missionaries had been interned and expelled at the beginning of the Second World War. The government was hostile to missions. The few Catholics of the Kimberleys felt isolated and abandoned by their church. And for 30 years, no expansion work has taken place.
The newly consecrated Bishop John Jobst set up headquarters in the town of Broome, on the far north coast of Western Australia. The township was as well known on the streets of London as any major Australian city. Ships from all over the world called into the tropical port to take on their valuable cargoes of pearl shell. The pearling luggers now have all but gone, the reefs fished out, but a legacy remains. Together with the Aborigines, Asians, particularly the Japanese, had close ties with Broome's pearling industry, and the cosmopolitan influence still remains. Nowhere is the pearling legacy more evident than at the town cemetery, where the silent rows of Japanese tombstones testify to the dangers faced by divers in one of the ocean's most valuable natural resources. Broome's lifeblood has become tourism. The mystique of its earlier heyday coupled with its tropical climate and long, uncluttered white beaches, have proved to be a mecca for visitors from within Australia as well as Asia and Europe. While Broome was giving birth to its renewed prosperity and growth, Bishop Jobst was making plans further afield, much to the disappointment of some local residents.
He was a lovely-looking young man. He came and all the women were gasping at the waist of this man coming up to be a bishop instead of one they could chase around the place. So I've often told him, you know, that many of them had their eyes on him, but it didn't do any good.
Long-time resident of Broome, Jean Haynes, well remembers the bishop's insatiable quest.
He was always one that was never satisfied with the small school they had. He said we must get more interested in and build the bigger schools and things for all the people.
But all the people were not within easy reach. Uncharted, tortuous bush tracks and a forbidding landscape lay between the bishop and the outback settlements. Travelling alone, weeks at a time, he came to learn the bush. He had to survive. And from the need for survival grew a respect and a love of the land he once disliked so much. The natural beauty of the Kimberley region captivated Bishop Jobst. A herd of wild donkeys startles a flock of white corollas at a nearby billabong. Their screeches shatter an almost eerie silence. Other wildlife, sensing danger, also take flight. The Kimberley is a land of contrasts. Its only human inhabitants for centuries, the Australian Aborigine. Their presence etched permanently wherever they went. But like the rock paintings, Aboriginal culture, their traditions, their whole way of life, faded with the arrival of European settlers. This became a familiar sight to Bishop Jobst on his early trips through the Kimberley. It was a sight which angered him, upset him.
I don't think that alcohol is bad in itself, because God made it, and God made it to that man enjoys it. And so we've been trying to educate people how to drink, and also help people to realize that drink or alcohol is a luxury of life, not the daily bread.
Bishop Jobst became convinced part of the solution lay with education, to give Aborigines hope and self-esteem, an alternative to what he saw as their degradation. John Jobst became known as John the Builder, albeit reluctantly.
I dislike building plans, I dislike specifications, I dislike discussing with architects new buildings, but it so happens you have to have buildings, don't you? And it's a necessary evil.
He supervised the construction of churches and schools, recruited teachers, lay workers, nurses and builders for Aboriginal communities in some of the most isolated areas of Australia. The remoteness, the hostile conditions of the outback, the lack of assistance from government did not stop him. He knew no bounds. Once on a visit to the Vatican, he had the temerity to personally ask the Pope of his own officials to staff an outback school. He got what he wanted. Personnel problems, though, continued to plague him. He found it difficult to find qualified teachers and other workers prepared to give up life's luxuries and devote all their energy and time to a race of people few understood, who lived in scattered parts of the Kimberley, not even large enough to warrant a mention on any map. To try to overcome his recruitment problems, Bishop Jobst took to advertising. He mounted his own advertising campaign in journals and newspapers, and visited all of Australia's major cities, seeking out what he describes as the committed teacher.
Unless a teacher is committed to teaching, dedicated, you won't get him to go out and isolate area where there's no social life, no entertainment.
The bishop prepares for a role he has played countless times, the official opening of a new school he has built. This one is closer than most to civilization, only 160 kilometres from the nearest town. It's been constructed at Turkey Creek, in the far north of the Kimberley. Like many, this community was formed from the need to find a lifestyle away from the European-run cattle or sheep stations, where some of its original members had worked, until they were thrown off when Aborigines became entitled to be paid wages. The Warnham community helped build the new school at Turkey Creek, the bishop supplying the materials and other manpower. The cost is partly met by the Australian government, the rest by the bishop. It was only in the 1970s the government formally recognised the educational empire that John the Builder had by then forged single-handed. He had increased the number of schools and teaching staff in the Kimberley by more than tenfold, and the students had risen from about 400 to over 1,200. He remains coy about the cost, estimated to total at least $4 million. All of the money came from the bishop's personal fundraising efforts, convincing supporters and business people in Australia, the United States and Europe of his need to give Aborigines an education.
But I don't think it's due to my diplomacy. There was a need there, and God provided. That is the secret.
The rigorous years of constant travel on rough bush tracks took their toll. Ill health nearly forced his early retirement. However, an Australia-wide appeal raised funds for a new mode of transport, and his exploits as a bush pilot became almost as legendary as his education empire. Bishop Jobst has survived at least 3 mishaps, but laughs them off with a well-rehearsed anecdote.
I was just landed on my first solo flight. You were nervous, and I got out of the airplane, and she said to me, Bishop, she said, do you feel closer when you're up there in the sky, flying an airplane, to God? I said, Madam, I would if I stepped out.
Bravo Delta Romeo has clocked up the equivalent distance to flying around the world 3 times. Bishop Jobst believes he must keep up personal contact to help motivate, to share in the joys and frustrations of his adopted people. Sister Claire Gardner, who sometimes accompanies the bishop on his whistle-stop trips.
The people call him Father Bishop. The people in most of the places, you'll hear them calling him Father Bishop. He likes to be addressed just by Bishop. But I think people from other places who have had, you know, training in when we were little children, we used to be told, the bishop's coming, you call him my lord, and all of that business. And I think that some of the older people maybe would call him that. But the general thing is, we call him Bishop, and the people out there say Father Bishop. I think that they look up to him. But also he talks to them, he talks to them on a friendly level. He knows so many of the families. He genuinely knows them.
However, this reverence, according to Peter Yu, a long-time critic of Bishop Jobst, is waning.
Well, obviously, because of the dogma and sort of the way that my mother's generation, people have been brought up, they have a lot of respect for the bishop, and it's sort of unquestionable as far as they're concerned. But I mean, as far as we're concerned, there certainly are a lot of questions that the bishop has to answer for.
Critics of the church claim the archetype of an outdated paternal system was fostered here, at the northern tip of Western Australia. The history of the seemingly idyllic settlement of Columbaroo is bathed in turmoil. The area was first settled by Benedictine monks in 1908, who set up camp at Pago on Napier Broom Bay. Despite repeated attacks by Aborigines, the monks continued attempts to befriend them with gifts and food. The lifestyle of the Aborigines appalled them. They documented cases of cannibalism, prearranged marriages to girls as young as 10, and what they considered pagan tribal initiations. The monks introduced Western Christian beliefs, but the infertile soil and lack of water at Pago eventually forced them to relocate their mission at nearby Columbaroo. Buildings were dismantled, materials transported, and in 1936, Pago was left to the ravages of nature. At Columbaroo, missionaries continued their work, teaching their Aboriginal charges to cook and bake bread, to plant crops and tend the plantations. Exotic fruits were introduced to the formerly barren ground and grew well in the tropical climate.
Michael James, I baptize you in the name of the Father.
New standards were introduced. The high infant mortality rate arrested, and more Aborigines were christened into the church. Many of the Aboriginal babies were delivered by the missionaries. Sister Josephine Scholastica, a resident of Columbaroo since 1950, watched the newborn children grow up.
They love us as their mothers. As a matter of fact, one day I was so wild with one of them, very big man now, and I slapped him and he says, look, sister, first he looked at me serious, and then he says, look, sister, I don't mind you hitting me, because after all, you are like my mother. I say, I hope not. I was so wild with him, because disobedient. And he says, but look, I wouldn't like anybody seeing you hitting me. I say, no, well, you behave. I won't hit you anymore. Like that. They are, like, very nice. They're good people.
The innocence of Columbaroo was shattered in 1943. Residents were left homeless by a Japanese bombing raid, and a priest and 5 Aborigines lost their lives. From the debris came resilience, and the settlement was rebuilt. But the Aboriginal land rights movement, which gained momentum in Australia in the 1970s, did what no war could: changed Columbaroo forever. Public attention became focused on what some saw as the autocratic rule of a Benedictine priest, Father Seraphim Sands, who had been the mission's mainstay throughout its post-war years. Almost overnight, his self-admitted paternalism towards the Aborigines became a dirty word. Critics of the Sands administration pointed to earlier forms of housing Aborigines in small corrugated iron shacks instead of the open air. They pointed to the refusal of the church to allow Aborigines to take charge of their own affairs, having to hand over their social security payments. And criticism was also made of the enforcement of the young to work in the plantations and in other parts of the mission. Columbaroo came under siege. Supporters of Father Sands blamed what they called white outsiders for the disenchantment among the Aboriginal population.
Putting in their heads ideas of money and of rebellion. And of course they pick the ones who can do more damage, more smart. And that's what happens then. It was bad. It was politics.
Bishop Jobst also well remembers the siege of Columbaroo. Although not then charged with the responsibility of the mission, he had to walk a fine line between the role of the church and the wishes of the Aborigines. With hindsight, he admits the church was slow in updating and adjusting its administration of Columbaroo.
The church could have withdrawn a little earlier and allowed the Aborigines to grow.
In 1981, the Benedictine order and Father Sands quit Columbaroo, Part of the mission land was handed over to the Aborigines, and they were given self-management.
I don't think they want them there to run their business for them. They want them there because they're friends and because they recognise that they have done some good things in the past. You know, it hasn't all been bad, but the fact is that the bad things that have happened have to be addressed by the church itself.
Bishop Jobst cites the siege of Kalambaroo as a blatant and expensive attempt to reduce the influence of the church.
The government had to pay millions of dollars for white employees, bookkeepers, secretaries, community advisors, tradesmen, you name them. Whereas the paternalistic system, it didn't cost the taxpayer a thing.
The Catholic Church remains at Kalambaroo, its presence low profile. Bishop Jobst is charged directly with its operation. With government assistance, the Aborigines, through an elected committee, run their own affairs, from the supply of power and housing to the payment of wages and social security benefits.
Right, you got him. It's a bit high, Peter. We'll have to dig that.
Church workers and the Aborigines mingle freely and happily, the fences between the two slowly being repaired. Their continuing relationship depends largely on Father Chris Saunders, who took over the daily administration of Kalambaroo from the Benedictine monks.
I think it's a long-term thing. I don't think you can have a short-term objective and say, I am going to, in the next 12 to 18 months, build up the self-esteem of these people. You can't do it. But what you can say is, long-term, I shall take an attitude of mind that gives them the rightful dignity that they deserve, to treat them as human beings, to give them the ability to grow and to develop, to give them opportunities and chances, and to take risks. And if it fails, to start again. And that's the big thing.
The weekly supplies arrive at Kalambaroo. In the past, the settlement grew most of its own fruit and vegetables and grazed cattle for fresh meat. Nowadays, it could not survive without the outside world. And paradoxically, there's an overstock of supplies, one of the legacies of the earlier community split. Two stores, carrying almost the same lines, cater to the permanent population of about 200. One store is run by the church, the other by the Aborigines, and both claim a viable patronage. The duplication of services epitomizes the problems facing the future development of Kalambaroo, problems the church lays at the feet of the government.
And what they have achieved over the last few years is to supplant one form of paternalism with another. And I'm not convinced that the new one is any better than the last. I'll go that far. The first one, the first form of paternalism, and missions were paternalistic, was based on love and charity. I'm not sure what the second one's based on.
The Nulungu College at Broome, the flagship of the education system established by Bishop Jobst in the Kimberley. Having learnt from past mistakes, like Kalambaroo, the Nulungu College has adopted a completely different approach. Principal Brother Peter Negus.
This school has 99% Aboriginal student population. There are something out of the 200, there are 10 whites, and it's good in a way that the whites are in the minority. In most cases, the Aboriginals are in the minority. And we learn, being here for 3 years, I've learned more and changed my values more than any other school that I've been in. And where I suppose giving them, as one of the aims of the place, is to be proud of their Aboriginality.
Each year, before the monsoon season, Bishop Jobst and teaching staff set out on their student enrolment drive for the college. They fly the length and breadth of the Kimberley in an exhaustive tour of almost every Aboriginal community, informing parents and prospective students of the college about the benefits of a secondary school education. After travelling thousands of kilometres, they fill the college quota of 50 new students. Most of the schools established in the Aboriginal communities only take students to primary level. It is far too costly to build, staff and equip secondary or high schools in remote areas with only small student numbers. For many of the students, the college is their first experience of living away from home, away from their natural surroundings.
Now what's this word is?
College students are taught their own tribal languages. Ironically, languages which have been lost in part because of the early missionary endeavours of the Catholic Church.
What we do here is we have a linguist and a teacher set aside. They teach the students to write their language as well as to speak it. And one of the difficulties we had here when it first opened was that the students would come and they'd feel ashamed of being an Aboriginal. Now, one of the big aims that we have at the college is that they're proud of their Aboriginality. And so we started to teach them their languages and to let them speak in their language rather than stop them in that. Now, that's developed. We have special Aboriginal studies and languages are featured, and they have a choice of learning the language or not. They don't have to learn it.
Students at the college are encouraged to maintain and enhance their cultural ties, their heritage.
Here they have a system where they have time set aside for art. With the children at their local areas, they wouldn't have that to the same extent. They wouldn't have the same materials. We have 2 Aboriginal teachers. The Aboriginals are in charge of the art centre. And apart from the natural ability art that a number of them have, then they can be taught techniques, for instance, in pottery, in type of paints and so on to be using. They wouldn't use watercolours normally. They do here. They have a wider perspective of art.
At the same time, the college introduces students to the latest in modern technology with which they have become particularly adept.
Before the Western style technique, we teach in question and answer. And they look at the situation where they say, well, if you know the answer, why you ask the question? They learn by looking, observing and learning. And that's in their whole traditional way of learning. So computers to them, anything that's visual is excellent for educating Aborigines. And we have full-blood Aboriginals here that are community ones that need to be taught in that style. So that's why computers are very good for them. They get instant reaction. They can look at a thing and observe, and they certainly learn very strongly in that field.
Like any school, health education plays an integral role. No distinction is made between male and female students in the college courses, but an emphasis is placed on warning against the abuse of alcohol and drugs.
What we stress is the fact that it is non-Aboriginal to drink, that it's an introduced thing, a Western style of life that's been brought in, so that really alcohol and drugs and petrol sniffing is against their culture. So we go from that side where we stress in their education side of it that they're anti-Aboriginal in many ways, and so it's against their culture.
Unlike any other school built by Bishop Jobst, the college was the first to sit on permanent foundations.
All our schools are prefabricated in the factory yard in Perth. They don't look prefabricated, don't look transportable, but they're put together in such a way that you wouldn't even notice it. So if the Aboriginal community decide to move somewhere else, we check up the buildings and move the buildings with the people.
Aborigines are, by nature, a mobile race, and their relationship with the environment unique, which is why this has become another important part of their education in the Kimberley. A day trip to the ancestral fishing grounds for school children living in one of the coastal communities. Fishing nets have replaced the tribal method of scattering crushed roots in the rock pools and shallow waters. Chemicals within the special roots worked as an anesthetic on the fish, sending them to sleep, and causing them to float to the surface. The Church believes practical school lessons like this are just as important for the development of Aboriginal children as any normal curriculum course. A community elder and his grandchildren search for clam shells amongst the fishing grounds, which once sustained 7 different tribal groups. Now, only 2 remain. They were extremely proficient fishermen, knowing exactly the time of year different species were to be expected near the reefs. It may not look appetizing, but clam meat is as much sought after as octopus or shark. The area is an aquatic Garden of Eden. Low tide reveals oysters growing on rocks stretching as far as the horizon. The plentiful supply and variety of seafood, most of it within arm's reach, would be the envy of restaurant diners the world over. Tortoises are another delicacy to the coastal communities in the Kimberley. The method of hunting and killing them unchanged for centuries. With the right skill, the murky waters of a billabong can supply enough food for a whole hunting party. Campfires are lit and the fresh catch of tortoises cooked for several minutes before they're ready to eat. There is little within their natural environment to which Aborigines have not adjusted over the centuries. They have even lived alongside and hunted one of the most feared and oldest creatures on Earth. Female crocodiles lay thousands of eggs a year in reeds and marshes in the Kimberley, but only 2% of the reptiles actually reach the age of maturity. The high infant mortality rate prompted the introduction of a ban on killing crocodiles in Western Australia in 1971. However, Aborigines were made exempt because the man-eaters are a traditional food. Nonetheless, Aborigines have a healthy respect for their prey, preferring to hunt at night when it's easier to catch crocodiles off guard. A metal-tipped spear is still favoured by tribal elders because the noise of firearms frightens off the crocodiles. Noise is kept to an absolute minimum as the lookout scans the darkness for the telltale presence of crocodiles. The eyes of the reptiles floating on the water's surface give off a luminous red glow. The boat is allowed to edge slowly towards its prey. The stillness of the night is suddenly pierced by the sound of the spear with a rope attached being flung into the water with the same speed and deadly precision as if it had been catapulted by a gun. The hunt is over. The beautiful and contrasting environment of the Kimberley has brought a new challenge to the Aboriginal communities: tourism. The spectacular chasms and gorges, the moonscape pinnacles, the tropical vegetation of the Bungle Range in the heart of the Kimberley are believed to be about 2,000 million years old. The natural monolith has attracted attention from tourists worldwide. Its popularity caught Aborigines living in the area by surprise. They had simply accepted it as part of their environment, but suddenly found themselves sharing it with sightseers and tourists. The Aborigines appealed for help to stop what they saw as the desecration of their land. Government finally struck a compromise. The whole Bungle Range was declared a national park, with local Aborigines appointed as park rangers to help manage the range. This is what Aborigines everywhere fear most: the prostitution of their culture, their traditions, by tourism. Performing for the enlightenment of tourists has become a regular attraction in communities which have opened their borders to visitors. Not to be daunted, other groups are attempting to go down the same road, but in a different direction. Signs advising entry to Aboriginal land line the route to one of the most ambitious tourism projects in the Kimberley. Few outsiders have seen the rugged but picturesque coastline of Cape Leveque. Financially supported by government, 2 Aboriginal communities living at former church missions nearby have joined to develop Cape Leveque into an international tourist resort. Progress, though, has been slow. The first accommodation units taking more than 1 year to reach this stage. Aborigines have been described as the timeless people, not governed by the clock, but rather by dawn and dusk.
The Aborigine has plenty of time to spend. And why rush? Why rush? Tomorrow looks after itself. The Aboriginal, in traditional style, lived from day to day, never stored anything. Why worry? And was the mentally healthiest person, I think, there is on the earth, on the face of the earth. So, to him, time means nothing.
It's with those sorts of comments and views that Bishop Jobst raises the ire of the Aboriginal rights movement, bureaucrats and politicians alike. However, he is just as forthright about the role his adversaries have played.
The government, with the best of intentions, tried to give the Aborigines money, give them everything, too much, too quickly, without asking anything in return.
The bishop continues to dig a path towards what he sees as the betterment of the lot of Aborigines in the Kimberley. Towards those who doubt or question his motives and methods, especially politicians, Bishop Jobst adopts a righteous attitude.
I would like to be a politician, but I don't think I ever could learn how to tell lies.
This is what Bishop John Jobst set out to achieve when he first arrived in Western Australia. Here, thousands of kilometres from any major city, Aborigines have gathered from near and far to celebrate their belief in Christianity. Bishop Jobst has lost count of how many bush church services he has attended, but he points to them as a recognition of the healthy coexistence between the church and Aborigines.
Most of the outsiders nowadays realize what the church has done for the Aboriginal people and appreciate that. But some outsiders, I mean, are people who have the wrong concept of the church.
Aboriginal tradition also plays an important role at these outback gatherings. Dancers ready themselves for a nighttime corroboree, while others prepare a feast to celebrate. Through dance, Aborigines have told of the dream time, stories about their heritage, their reason for living as they do, and how they actually came to be. With the encroachment of Western civilization, many of the Dreamtime stories were lost, but the corroboree survived. What remains is now being passed on. Fathers and sons dance alongside one another, and a new generation comes to learn and appreciate the worth of their ancestry. What the future holds for the next generation depends not only on their collective will, but also on the goodwill of white Australians. At present, neither can be relied upon. For Aboriginal willpower is dependent on incentive and self-esteem, and European goodwill on insight, patience, and understanding.
I have no feeling of guilt because the Aborigines were so happy. They're happy and contented.
He's provided so much for education in the Kimberley, you know, single-handed in those early years before we ever had any assistance.
He seems to be a boss of his own. I mean, as far as you hear stories about him being a bit of a renegade in the Australian bishop scene, perhaps the only one he's accountable to is the Pope.
If I was appointed bishop again, I would make mistakes, but the mistakes were different ones.